had cleaned his house for 3 months. I had made his coffee and folded his shirts and moved through his rooms with the careful invisibility of someone who understood that the arrangement required me to be useful without being present. I was 23 years old and I needed the work, and I had never once given him a reason to see me as anything other than exactly what he had hired. And then I found the papers. I was not looking for them. I was cleaning around them, the way I cleaned around everything in that study, careful not to disturb, careful not to be noticed, careful in the way I had been careful every day for 3 months in a house that belonged to a man who had been waiting, without my knowing it, for exactly this moment. I read my father's name. I read it again. I looked up. He was standing in the doorway. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The expression on his face was the expression of a man running a calculation, not a moral one, not an emotional one, just the specific arithmetic of a problem that has presented itself and requires a solution before morning. He smiled. He said goodnight. And he went upstairs and he slept. By the time I tried my door the next morning, it was locked from the outside. My bag had been searched. My phone was gone. On the kitchen table, my passport lay with its edges still warm and its pages fused into something that was no longer a document and no longer a way out. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply removed every mechanism by which I could leave. And then he made coffee and picked up his briefcase and went to the office with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once been wrong about a person he has underestimated. He had never before underestimated the daughter of the man he had stolen from. He did not know that yet. He was already in his car. And on the other side of the wall that separated his property from the building next door, a man in a dark navy suit was standing completely still, with one hand pressed flat against the plaster, listening to a 23-year-old woman in a locked room doing the one thing Jason Mercer had not accounted for. Not crying. Not breaking. Thinking. This is that story. I learned early that the most reliable thing about the world was that it required you to show up for it. My mother taught me this without words, through the specific demonstration of a woman who rose at 5 every morning for 22 years and made something from the raw material of what was available, which was never quite enough and was always sufficient. My father taught it differently. My father taught it through the building, through the way he talked about the company he was constructing in the years when I was small enough to sit on his desk and watch him work, not understanding the papers, but understanding the quality of his attention, the way a man looks when he is making something that matters. He died when I was 19. He did not tell me everything before he went. I understood this later, that there were things he had meant to say and had run out of time for, that the illness had moved faster than his intention, that he had left believing I would be fine because he had raised a woman who would be fine, and he had not reckoned with the specific things that would require me to be more than fine. I came to Jason Mercer's house because the rent was due and the position paid well and the requirements were clear. Live-in, Monday through Saturday. A large house in a quiet neighborhood, one occupant, a man who traveled frequently and required the kind of orderly maintenance that an empty house accumulates against. I was not the first person he had hired for this. I understood myself to be a practical arrangement, which suited me. Practical arrangements had a clarity I trusted. 3 months passed. The routine settled into my body the way routines do. The kitchen first, then the upper floors, the study last because the study required the most care. Jason was particular about the study. I had learned the specific geography of his desk early. What could be moved and what was to be cleaned around, the stacks that were working stacks and the ones that were archive, the particular placement of things that communicated that the room had a system and the system was not mine to alter. I was cleaning around a stack on a Tuesday afternoon when the paper at the edge of it caught my attention. Not because I was looking, because of the name. I had heard it once, the company name, in a hospital room when I was 19, my father's voice using it in the specific register of a man trying to make something sound like it did not matter. I had filed it the way you file things you do not yet have a frame for. I had not thought about it since. I thought about it now. I set down the cloth. I read the document slowly, the way you read something that keeps rearranging the architecture of everything you thought you understood. My father's name on the original incorporation. The date, years before I was born. The transfer, a signature I recognized, reproduced in a period I recognized. During a hospitalization I had sat beside and watched and not understood was being used. I looked up. Jason was standing in the doorway. Neither of us spoke. Everything that followed was already decided in that silence, though I did not know it yet, and he had been counting on exactly that. He said goodnight at 9:17. I know the time because I had been watching the clock on the kitchen wall with the focused attention of a person who has understood that they are in a situation that requires them to remember everything. The way he said it was ordinary. Not warm. Jason Mercer was not a warm man, but calibrated to the register of a normal evening, a normal house, a normal employer ending a normal day. He did not look at me differently. He did not linger. He went upstairs, and I heard his bedroom door close, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about the documents and what they meant and what I was going to do. I did not hear the rest of it. That was the design of it. I understood this later, reconstructing the sequence with the clear, cold attention I would apply to everything that followed. He had not moved quickly. He had not moved loudly. He had simply moved through the house in the hours after I went to my room, making the specific adjustments of a man who had thought this through before the day it became necessary. My bag was on the chair beside my bed. I did not hear him open my door. I did not hear him go through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and where people kept it. I heard nothing until morning. The light came through the small, high window the way it always did, the particular gray of early morning in a house that faced north, thin and unconvinced. I lay still for a moment in the way I always lay still before beginning a day, taking the measure of it. Then I got up. Then I tried the door. The handle turned. The door did not open. I tried it again with the specific disbelief of a person whose body has not yet accepted what their mind already knows. The door held, locked from the outside, not a mechanism I had ever noticed on this door, because it was not the kind of lock that announces itself. The kind that is installed by someone who has thought about this before the occasion requires it. I stood at the door for a moment. Then I went to find my bag. My phone was gone. My wallet was on the table beside the bed, untouched. He had understood. I would realize later that money was not the point. The point was documentation. The point was the thing that said I existed in the world as a person with a name and a nationality, and a place I had the legal right to return to. I found it on the kitchen table. I could see it through the gap under my door, the corner of it visible on the kitchen tile, the particular discoloration of something that had been held over a flame long enough to be made into something else. I did not need to touch it to know. I already knew. I sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, I heard Jason's car start. I heard it back out of the driveway. I heard it reach the end of the street and turn and become nothing. The house was completely silent. I sat in it for a long time. Then I made a decision, not about what to do, not yet, but about how to be while I figured out what to do. I was not going to panic. I was not going to perform fear for a room that contained no one. I was not going to spend a single unit of energy on anything that did not move me forward. I had 36 hours of silence, and the full contents of my mind, and a father who had taught me, without knowing he was teaching me, that the people who take things from you count on you not being able to think clearly when it matters most. I breathed. I began to think. I did not know about Jai Mayung yet. I did not know that on the other side of the wall that separated Jason's property from the building next door, a man was standing in the cold blue light of his apartment at 2 in the morning, with his hand pressed flat against the plaster, listening to me. I know it now. I know the full shape of what happened on his side of that wall, and I have thought about it many times in the years since. The specific detail of a man who had spent 20 years building a system for ensuring that other people's problems remained other people's problems, standing at a wall and finding, for the first time, that the system had reached something it could not file. This is what I know about Jai Mayung. He was not indifferent. Indifference is passive, a condition of not noticing. What he practiced was active and deliberate. He noticed everything. He had trained himself to notice everything because the alternative in the world he occupied was the specific vulnerability of a man who is surprised. He noticed and he assessed and he filed. The filing was the discipline he had maintained across 2 decades and 4 cities, and the accumulated weight of things heard through walls and windows, and the thin partitions of a life constructed in the spaces between visible and invisible. He had heard many things through that wall in 14 months. He had filed all of them. He was reading at 2 in the morning when the sound of my voice came through. Not loud, not distressed, and that, he told me much later, was the first thing that registered. The absence of distress in a sound that, given what he would come to understand about its context, should have been full of it. He heard me going through the documents from memory. Dates, names, a sequence of events rendered in precise, unhurried language. Document numbers cited with the confidence of someone who had read them recently enough that they had not yet begun to fade. He set down his book. He crossed the room. He pressed his hand flat against the plaster, and he stood there in the cold blue light of his apartment with the city silent beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows, and he listened. He understood, he told me later, that I was building a case, not metaphorically. Literally, assembling evidence from memory, structuring it, testing the sequence of it against itself. Doing this alone in a locked room at 2 in the morning without apparent distress and without apparent doubt. He stood at the wall for a long time. He did not go back to sleep. I did not know any of this was happening. I was building the case. The first thing I did was establish what I had. Not what I had lost, the phone, the passport, the open door, but what remained. What Jason had not thought to take because it did not occur to him that it could be taken. The contents of my mind were still entirely mine. Everything I had read on that Tuesday afternoon was still there, intact, in the specific way that things are intact when you have read them with the quality of attention that comes from recognizing your own name in a place it was never supposed to appear. I started with the documents. I went through them the way I had gone through them on the desk, slowly, in sequence, allowing each detail to occupy its full space before moving to the next. The original incorporation date, the founding names, my father's signature on the first page, the real one, the one I knew from birthday cards and the backs of photographs, and the single letter he had written me when I left for my first job at 18 and told me to keep it somewhere I could find it. I kept it. I knew his signature. I knew what his signature was not. The transfer document had been executed during a 6-week hospitalization. I had been 19. I had sat in that hospital for 11 days of those 6 weeks, and I had watched my father's hands, and I knew with the specific certainty of a person reconstructing evidence from lived experience that the signature on the transfer was not something those hands had produced. Not in those weeks, not in that condition. I moved to the numbers. Document reference numbers, account routing sequences, the 4 corporate restructurings that had followed the transfer in 18-month intervals. Each one moving the original ownership one layer deeper into an architecture designed to survive the kind of scrutiny that stops at the surface. I recited them aloud because saying them fixed them, because my memory was better when my voice was involved, because the locked room had given me something Jason had not intended to give me: complete silence, complete stillness, the total absence of the ordinary interruptions that prevent a person from thinking at the depth a problem actually requires. Time moved differently inside it. I had expected the slowness to be a weight. Instead, it was a medium, dense, and clarifying, the way cold water clarifies. I was not waiting. I was not marking hours against their passing. I was working, and the work had a quality it had never had in ordinary time because ordinary time had always contained the next thing, and here there was no next thing except the one I was building. My father had mentioned 3 locations once. I was 16. He was driving. He said it in the context of something else entirely, a lesson about preparation, about the specific foolishness of keeping everything in one place, about how the people who want to take things from you count on consolidation. I had not understood it as instruction. I had filed it the way you file a thing that has no immediate application. It had an application now. I said the locations aloud. I said them again. I was not waiting to be rescued. That was not what those 36 hours were. They were the preparation, the quiet, methodical construction of something that a locked room had made possible and a man with a briefcase had made necessary. I kept going. While I was in the locked room building the case from the inside, Jai Myung was building it from the outside. I did not know this yet. I would not know it until the door opened and I walked into a kitchen that contained documents I had not placed there. But I know it now, and I want to tell you what he did because it matters, not because it rescued me, but because it confirmed, from a direction I had not expected, everything I had already assembled in the dark. He made the first call at 4:30 in the morning. He gave 3 pieces of information: a name, a property address, and the specific category of document he needed located. He did not explain why. The people he called did not require explanation. Explanation was for relationships built on trust, and what Jai Myung had built instead, with great deliberateness over 20 years, were relationships built on precision. You said exactly what you needed. You received exactly that. He made the second call at 5. This one was to a man who understood the architecture of corporate restructuring the way other men understood weather, as a system with its own internal logic, its own patterns, its own tells. Jai Myung described the sequence my father's company had been put through. He asked not for a conclusion, but for the thread, the specific legal filament that, when pulled, would cause the structure above it to become visible for what it was. The man called back in 40 minutes. The thread was there. It had always been there. The restructurings had been designed to obscure it but not to sever it, because severing it would have required a level of legal exposure that Jason had not been willing to risk. This was, I understand now, the specific miscalculation of a man who believed that something buried deeply enough was the same as something gone. It was not the same thing. It was simply something that required the right kind of looking. The third call located my father's trail. Jai Myung had encountered the pattern before. A careful man operating under a deadline, not of his choosing, distributing things he could not take with him, placing them in locations that meant something to the person they were intended for. He described the profile. The woman he called knew the type. She knew the specific logic of where such a man would place things and how many locations he would choose. She called back before 6. 3 locations, all of them intact. Jai Myung stood at his window with the city going pale at the edges, and the wall behind him, and the sound of me on the other side of it still working. Still steady, still entirely unaware that the case I had been building in isolation for 36 hours had just acquired, from the outside, every piece I had not yet been able to reach. He told himself he was doing this because a wrong was being committed in a space adjacent to his own. He was still telling himself this. He was becoming less convinced. I had not understood, when I was small, what my father was building. I understood it now. The 3 locations he had chosen were not random. Each one was a place I had been. A place I knew the address of without having to search for it. The church where my grandmother's funeral was held when I was 12. The library branch 3 streets from the apartment where we had lived when I was 7. The storage unit my father had maintained for as long as I could remember, and told me once, in passing, that the key for was on the ring with the car keys I had inherited and still carried. I had carried it for 4 years, without knowing what it opened. I knew now. The documents were thorough in the way that only a dying man's documents are thorough, assembled with the knowledge that they would need to stand without him, that they would need to be clear enough for a person encountering them alone to understand without guidance. My father had written notes in the margins in his careful, deliberate hand. Not legal annotations. Explanations. The kind you write for someone you love who will be reading this without you. I read them in sequence, and I understood, for the first time, the full shape of what had been done. My father had known. Not immediately. Jason had been patient, and the patience had looked, for a long time, like loyalty. But in the last year, in the months when the illness was making everything slower and the paperwork was accumulating, and the decisions that required his signature were arriving with increasing frequency, he had understood what was happening. He had not been able to stop it. He had been outmaneuvered in the specific way that a man who trusts can be outmaneuvered by a man who does not, through the machinery of that trust, through the access it provided, through the signatures it made available during a hospitalization when the body was unreliable and the mind was managing pain. He had not been able to stop it. He had documented everything. I sat with the last letter for a long time. It was the shortest one. It said only that he was sorry I would have to do this, that he believed I could, that he had tried to make it as clear as possible from his end, and that the company had always been intended to be mine, and he was sorry it would require a fight to make that true. I folded it carefully. I allowed myself 60 seconds. The grief was real and it was enormous, and it would require, eventually, the full weight of my attention. My father had been taken from me twice, once by illness, and once by a man who had used that illness as a mechanism. Both losses were real. Both would need to be sat with fully, properly, with nothing else requiring my attention. But not yet. The grief could wait. It had waited 4 years. It could wait until the door of my father's company had the right name on it again. I set the letter down. I picked up the evidence. I began to prepare. I heard it at 6:43 in the morning. Not a knock, not a voice, just the specific sound of a lock releasing, a single clean movement, mechanical and unhurried, the sound of a thing being undone by someone who knew exactly how it worked and had no interest in announcing themselves. I had been awake. I had been awake for most of the 36 hours, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed, with the full architecture of the case assembled in my mind when the sound came and the door, which had not opened yesterday or the day before, stood fractionally ajar. I did not move immediately. I sat with it for a moment, not from fear, but from the same instinct that had governed the last 36 hours, the refusal to spend a single unit of energy on anything that was not deliberate. I listened to the house. It was empty. Not the emptiness of a house between moments, but the emptiness of a house that currently contained only me. I stood up. I pushed the door open and stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame. The hallway was unchanged. The kitchen at the end of it caught the early morning light the way it always did. I moved through it steadily, one foot and then the other forward. The kitchen table stopped me. Not because of what was missing from it. The charred passport had been cleared away by hands I did not yet know. What stopped me was what had been placed there instead. A stack of documents, printed and organized with a precision that told me immediately that whoever had assembled them understood exactly what they were looking at. My father's name on the original incorporation. The transfer documents. The 4 restructurings laid out in sequence with the relevant provisions, marked in a way that made the thread visible at a glance. Beside the stack, a phone, fully charged. Beside the phone, a card with a single address written on it, and below the address, a number. I stood at the table and read through the documents slowly. By the 3rd page, I understood what had happened. Someone had been working in parallel with me, from the outside, through channels I could not have accessed from a locked room, arriving at the same place I had arrived at from within. The evidence was the same evidence. The structure of it matched the structure I had been assembling in the dark for 36 hours with nothing but memory and my father's careful preparation. I did not know who yet. I picked up the phone. I dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. A voice answered, male, quiet, the specific economy of someone who had been expecting the call and saw no reason to perform surprise. He said my name. He gave me 2 pieces of information. He did not explain himself, and I did not ask him to because the documents on the table had already told me the only thing I needed to know, that the work I had done in the locked room was not wasted, that the case was complete, that I had everything I needed. I ended the call. I picked up the documents. I walked to the front door and opened it and stepped outside into the morning air, and I did not look back at the house because the house was no longer relevant. I was moving. I had everything. I had been in that building before. Not inside the boardroom, That room had always been closed to me, the kind of room that communicates its own inaccessibility through the weight of the door and the quality of the carpet. But I had stood in the lobby at 19 with my father on a Tuesday afternoon when he had brought me to show me something he was proud of, and I had watched him move through the space with the ease of a man among his own things. I had not understood then what I was watching. I understood it now as I walked through the same lobby with the same documents my father had assembled, and 4 years of Jason Mercer's careful architecture prepared to come apart in a room full of people who did not yet know what they were about to witness. I did not hurry. This was the thing about thorough preparation. It removed the need for urgency. Urgency is for people who are not certain. I was certain. I had been certain since the 3rd hour in the locked room when the sequence of documents had arranged themselves in my memory into something that was not just evidence, but argument, complete, sequential, each piece supporting the next with the structural integrity of something built rather than assembled. The meeting had been called under the pretense of a routine ownership review. The people in the room, board members, 2 attorneys, a financial auditor who had been given enough information to understand his role without being given everything, looked up when I entered with the collective expression of people who had been told to expect something, but had not been told to expect this. Jason was at the head of the table. He saw me, and his face did the thing that faces do when they encounter something the mind has categorized as impossible: a fractional delay, a recalibration moving across his features in the time it takes to blink, and then the confidence returning because the confidence was the thing he had built his entire adult life on, and it did not yield immediately to a single piece of information. I set the documents on the table. I did not introduce myself. Everyone in the room knew who I was. I had made certain of that before I walked through the door. I began with the incorporation, my father's name, the founding date, the original structure of ownership, clean and unambiguous, documented in the hand of a man who had understood that clarity was its own form of protection. I moved to the transfer, the hospitalization dates, the signature, and here I placed beside it the authenticated sample from documents executed before and after the illness. And I allowed the room to look at them together and arrive at its own conclusion, which it did, quietly, with the particular quality of attention that falls over a group of people who are understanding something in real time. I moved through the 4 restructurings without pausing. Jason's confidence lasted until the 3rd one. I watched it go. Not dramatically. It receded, layer by layer, the way the tide recedes, and what was underneath was not the face of a villain. It was the face of a man who had spent 4 years in a room he had built on a foundation he had never expected anyone to find, looking at a 23-year-old woman who had memorized every number, understanding fully and finally the precise identity of the person he had locked in that room. He had looked at me for 3 months and seen exactly what he wanted to see. He had never seen my father's daughter. I closed the folder. The room was very quiet. I let it be quiet for exactly as long as it needed to be. The name on the door was my father's. I stood in front of it for a moment before I went in, not from hesitation, but from the specific need to be present for it, to let the fact of it occupy its full space before the next thing began. Calvin Green. The letters clean and new against the frosted glass, replacing 4 years of someone else's name with the one that had always belonged there. I looked at it the way you look at something you have been moving toward for a long time and have not allowed yourself to fully imagine, because imagining it would have cost you something you needed for the work. I went in. The office was empty in the early morning. The legal transfer had been completed 2 days ago, methodical, documented, unassailable, built on evidence my father had assembled from a hospital bed and distributed across 3 locations for a daughter he would not live to see collect it. The staff would arrive in an hour. There were decisions to make and structures to assess, and the long, careful work of understanding what I had inherited and what it required of me. I was not afraid of that work. I sat at the desk, my father's desk, returned along with everything else, and I opened the last envelope. I had been carrying it for 3 weeks, since the day the storage unit gave it to me along with everything else. I had known without reading it that it was different from the others. The others had been preparation, evidence and instruction, and the careful architecture of a man ensuring that what he built could be recovered. This one was smaller. My name on the front in his handwriting, nothing else. I read it slowly. He did not talk about the company. He did not talk about the documents or the transfers or the 4 years of careful theft he had spent his last months trying to counteract. He talked about me, about the specific quality of my attention when I was small, the way I listened, the way I held a problem, the way I had always been more interested in understanding how something worked than in being told what it was. He said he had watched me become someone extraordinary without ever quite finding the right moment to tell me that was what he saw. He said he was sorry for the fight I would have to have. He said he had never once doubted I would win it. He said the company was always meant to be a thing I grew into, not a thing I was handed. I folded the letter. I held it for a moment. Then I placed it in the top drawer of the desk, beside the other two, beside the key I had carried for 4 years without knowing what it opened, and I looked up. Jai Myung was at the edge of the doorway, not inside, not presuming, standing in the specific way of a man who has done something he is still working out the reason for and is not in a hurry to resolve. He had not asked for anything. He had not named what the last 3 weeks had been or suggested what they might become. I looked at him for a moment. I did not yet know what this was. I knew what it was not. It was not debt. It was not the particular weight of owing someone something I did not choose to owe. It was not obligation dressed as gratitude, which is its own kind of locked room and one I had no intention of entering. I thought about the wall, about the sound of a lock releasing at 6:43 in the morning, about the documents on the kitchen table assembled with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at, about a man who had spent 20 years not getting involved and had found on a Wednesday morning the thing that made him reconsider. I looked at him for a moment longer. Then I looked back at my father's desk. "Come in," I said. And I got to work. My name is Tammy Green. I am 23 years old. My father built something real, and a man tried to take it, and he locked me in a room to stop me from getting it back. He gave me 36 hours of silence instead. I used every one of them. That is what happened. That is what I did with it. Thank you for listening.